Okay, so another video here, and this one is sort of on suffering, and it's on the value of suffering, and it's on the need to make time for our suffering and really experience it, and also how to conceive of it or understand suffering in the context of a path that leads to union with God. So everything on my channel is geared towards union with God. If someone didn't want union with God, then they might take some of this advice differently, turn left when I say go right. The path unfolds a certain way. And if you want to go all the way into union with God, there are some things you have to do that might not make sense to somebody that isn't interested in union with God. There's a level of purification and a level of clearing out the soul and the mind and the emotional body. There's a level of that work that needs to be done if you're going into union with God that doesn't have to be done if you're not going there. Now, there could be arguments made for everyone needs to do this work anyway, and really good arguments. The best one I think is any amount of suffering that we don't heal, we pass on to our children. Period. All of it. In the energy field, in just the subtle ways that they imprint upon us. And so we're doing a great service to humanity to take the suffering that was placed in us from generationally, but also just from our environment and, where we live and our upbringing and just the general cultural sort of suffering that, that different countries seem to have. So we're doing a huge service to humanity to get all of that undone and just let it be gone. So the world puts suffering inside of us, and we transform that suffering until it's gone. And there is now that much less suffering in the world. And that has to be a part of redemption and salvation. There's a scripture somewhere where Paul talks about making up for the part of salvation that Jesus didn't do in us, that we also participate in that and do that part. And, we are members of the body of Christ. So to some degree, all of us have a function to fulfill. And that function is within the context of salvation, right? Of transforming the world, transforming ourselves and the world towards greater and greater peace, joy, and love. And so dealing with suffering is a part of that. And so really anybody, I guess the argument could be made that anybody on the planet ought to take that part of life seriously. But for the aspiring contemplative, for the mystic, for the person who has decided that I want union with God to be the goal of my life, and everything else I do is going to be in support of that, right? So without that motivation, really what we have is people are driven by certain things. And, if you ask people what's the most important thing in their life, they'll oftentimes say family or, religion, God, who knows? But what we find in practice is that if you take the amount of time people spend on those things that they say are the most important, oftentimes the amount of time spent is not very much. So we're talking about a context that really does lead to union with God, all the way into union with God, a true kind of enlightenment that the Christian saints have left us literature about, that Jesus passed on to his disciples, and that we're invited to participate in. And we're taking that pretty seriously. And you're invited to too if you don't know. If you listen to Christianity, I mean, the meat of it, the depth of it, there's a lot of periphery, and I don't want to judge that in any way, but because I feel like people are called to different levels of depth, and I myself, I'm stuck at a certain level of depth. I'd like to be deeper too. But Christianity itself, Jesus incarnated so that, this is a saying you hear in Christianity, God became a human being so that human beings could become one with God. That's the reason. When someone asks, what is God's will for me? And they want to get an answer, right? They want to pull out some tarot cards or throw some rune sticks, right? Or some yarrow sticks, or they want to talk to a psychic, or they want to have a vision, or they want to have an angel come and tell them God's plan for them. I mean, I get that impulse a little bit, but it's missing something. That whole impulse is really missing something big. And what it's missing is that the God's will for humanity has already been revealed. It's been told to us by the prophets. It's been told to us by the saints, and it's been told to us by Jesus. And God's will for every single human being is for them to become a saint. It is. It's sainthood, enlightenment, that should never be viewed as something for special people. That's a tidy little way that egoic culture and egoic thinking has neatly put God away into a corner so that we don't have to be burdened by it. I mean, that is what that is. The fact is, everybody is called to union with God. Everybody is invited. And if you want to know what's God's will for you, God's will for you is for you to come into union with God. That's God's will. And yeah, there's probably a calling involved in that, because as your gifts and most importantly, as your soul is purified and healed and comes into some kind of love, of course you have some function, right? You have a function within the body of Christ. You play a role. And you play that role more and more effectively the more awake and enlightened you become. So there's a lot of side parts to, like, what is God's will for you? But if you want to know what God's will for you is, for sure, 24/7, all day long, every day, deeper than all other things that are asked of us, it's union with God. That's God's will. So in the context of, I would like to actually find union with God, I would like all of the barriers to love removed from my soul so that I can love fully. Because union with God is had in love. That's what it is. If that's the goal, then purification is a major piece of it. And I wanted to do this segment on just the notion of how important purification is and how we must make time for suffering to come into perfect love. That there is no way into perfect love without also suffering. And don't think of this now as a hoop God would make you jump through first before you get rewarded with love. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is you can't love fully until your wounds are healed fully. You can't. So the things that we carry around, the wounds that we have in our soul and in our hearts, these things must be healed in order for us to come into love. They must be. And so suffering is a part of that. And how you suffer really matters. And, any mystical system worth its salt will teach people how to suffer. And encourage people to suffer. And, I think when I was in the sort of alternative spiritual communities, when I had not yet heard about Jesus in a deep way or Christian spirituality, I read a lot of books, and, it seemed to me that most of them were trying to inspire me, trying to lift me up, inspire me, get me into a positive attitude, in a good mood, and also focus me in the upper sort of spiritual realms of bliss and visions and things like that. And it's as powerful as that is, and I think it is quite powerful, and it's half the picture, I think. There's this other part of the picture that I think sells less books. If Jesus gives you in the scriptures, he's always telling you what you'll have if you do what he says. And it's some pretty good stuff. But a lot of times he throws in, and suffering. They think, well, I don't want to suffer. I don't want to do that. Well, the path to union with God requires suffering. And anyone who wants to walk only sweet roads is unfit for union with God. Now, if you only want to walk sweet roads, you're fit for union with God. You just have to have a change of heart about that piece. You have to decide you're not so afraid of it, that you're willing to walk through it, that you're willing to be burdened by it. And that's kind of what this whole segment is about. We have to reframe what it means to have a bad day. A bad day is when I don't do what God had laid out for me. That's a bad day. So here's a way I could have a really bad day. I could wake up in the morning and meditate, and then I could come out of deep meditation in touch with some kind of pain, some kind of psychological, there's judgment, right? Just think how many people you judge on a daily basis, and think about how many people you feel judged by on just judgment, right? We're not talking the other many sins, but just judgment. Think how much judgment is in your life. How you feel better than people and how you feel less than people all the time. Well, that's terrible for love. That makes love almost impossible. It just does. We can't, Jesus said, don't judge lest you be judged. In the same measure you judge others will be measured back to you. And so let's translate that. If you won't let everyone else into God's love, you don't get to be in God's love either. Not because God holds you back, but because you put yourself out of God's love. You place your own self outside of God's love. So just judgment alone, not the 15 other sins we could notice, but let's just say you wake up and you have a lot of judgment going on and you notice it. Well, why? What wounds lie underneath that judgment that cause you to judge? What pride? What ugly things lie in the soul that cause it to judge all day long? Is that something that should just be brushed away, put away neatly, and choose to have a great day? That's a bad day. That's a bad day if you do that. If you brush that away, don't get to the bottom of it, don't take the roots of that to God for healing, you just had a bad day. Even if you chose to be super positive, put on a huge smile, and talked yourself into a good mood by noon. See, we have to get to the bottom of this stuff. And it's more accurate to say we have to let God root out and heal these things within us. And I'm not even talking about judgment, really. It's everything. It's fear and pride and arrogance and anger and lust and all the things that drag us down and keep us from truly valuing other human beings as children of God. So suffering must come. And we find that it comes quite naturally. It just comes. Life triggers it in us. Events trigger it in us. But also we have these cycles where it is just triggered in us for no reason at all. And I think on a contemplative path that leads to union with God, there really isn't much room for just shoving that away and choosing to be happy all over the top of it. Something smells off in the room, but let's just spray a bunch of perfume. Well, no, don't do that. Let's get down on the carpet and find out where this odor is coming from, and let's root it out. Let's get it all the way out of us. That's a part of the path. And, people that are new on the path, it seems to me I've noticed they always tend to view when they come into a cycle and they wake up in a really rough patch, right, where there's disorder. And this happens more if you meditate and not less. Because meditation weakens the barriers between our unconscious and conscious mind. And so we are much more vulnerable to the suffering that lies in our soul. Because of meditating, we're more prone to find peace and love, but we're also more prone to notice suffering of various kinds within us. If you wake up with that kind of disorder in you, that's what the day is for. That's what the day is for. The day is for noticing that, making friends with that, giving it your undivided attention, discovering its roots, discovering its strongholds within the soul, feeling it, weeping if you need to weep, right? Crying if you need to cry, hurting if you need to hurt. All of that in this cloud of God, though, all of that in the cloud of prayer. And that is a part of the spiritual path. And it's my experience that people don't make enough time for that. They just don't make enough time for that kind of work. And I certainly did not, and I didn't want to. I was very, very scared of the pain that was down in my guts. And I did not want to have to face it or deal with it or feel it. And people would say suffering is a part of spiritual growth. And I would say if suffering was a part of spiritual growth, I'd already be a saint. Because I've been suffering my whole life. But there's different ways to suffer. If you suffer unwillingly, resentfully, filled with self-pity, with blame, if you suffer and avoid, do everything you can to get out of it all the time, that kind of suffering doesn't make someone a saint at all. But the kind of suffering where you are feeling funky, if something is up, okay, something is up. And you go and lay down on the bed and close your eyes. You can sit in a chair too. I like to lay down for this kind of work. I like to lay on my side for this kind of work a lot. I don't know why, I just do. You go alone in a room, close your eyes, and you put all of your attention, rather than trying to avoid it, you put all your attention on it. And you feel it. And you allow the mind to start thinking about it. And you take all of that activity down into prayer with God. And you're not asking for God to do a specific thing for you. I mean, it's okay to ask God to heal your suffering as long as what you mean by that is you're giving God permission to initiate whatever process is required to get you healed of suffering. It wouldn't be okay to ask God to remove that suffering today, because that's a huge agenda, and it might be 3 years before this particular form of suffering is fully healed in you. So we got to be really careful that we're in there actually praying and not telling God what to do. There's a fine line there. So because I'm not sure what to say, because when I pray, when I go and do that work, I can't step back and observe what I'm saying to God. And when I come out, I forget anything I said down in there. But it's something like, here I am, God, I'm so filled with fear, or I'm so filled with pride. I lack any humility. Here is this sin in me. And I offer it to you. I give it to you. I'm sorry. I want to be different. I give you permission to heal me, but without any sense of pressure or force. Because that all, you can't, if you think of your relationship with God as a relationship, it's easy to spot things that aren't going to work. And so you know that no one in your life wants to be bossed around by you. Nobody in your life wants to be manipulated or bossed around by you. And if you do that, eventually, unless they're really sick, they pull away, right? You lose people that way. Okay, so God doesn't want to be bossed around by you either. And we're missing something when we give God suggestions about what to do. We're missing God's infinite wisdom and our very small, finite wisdom. We're missing God's grand picture for the unfolding of our soul in the body of Christ, as a member of the mystical body of Christ. We're missing that, and we're confusing this small agenda that I'd like to feel better by 10 a.m. We're confusing that, right? There's something missed there. So if you're going to go to God with this suffering, you're going to God knowing God is the great healer, knowing that God is, the physician that heals souls and heals psychological and emotional wounds and damage. This is for certain. God does this. God does it all the time for people who turn to God for it. But in that very moment, we can't expect any specific kind of healing to happen. We're just saying, here I am, God. Here is my suffering. Here's me. And here I am with you. And we try to sink down in prayer and forget the world, close our eyes, forget the world, where it's just us down in this secret place where you're interacting with God. And if you slip into sleep during that process, that's very healing. If you slip into meditation during that process, that is very healing. Or if you just remain dwelling there with God, that is very healing. I said, you can cry in that space. You can feel that pain. Oftentimes people will feel like they're going to vomit. I tend to dry heave quite often when I get in touch with certain things inside of me, and it feels like it's in my guts, and I'll feel like I'm going to throw up, but I'll just dry heave a few times, and it just happens naturally, but it seems to get some of it out. And so why would you take all the time to do that? Why would you want to waste a day walking through suffering when you could be out succeeding? Becoming successful, accomplishing things. Well, because you have a goal, and the goal is union with God. And this is how you accomplish that. You have a success in mind. It's God's idea of success for human beings, which is enlightenment. And this is part of how you do that. And it cannot be overlooked, and it cannot be overstated either. Jesus summed up the way into union with God in the Beatitudes. So each Beatitude it's a process, it's an initiation, and it's a transformation. And each Beatitude could take a number of years to complete, and really, as far as I'm concerned, it's a lifetime, right? So the second Beatitude is, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And, that saying used to really bug me. I did not like that at all. I didn't want to hear that. That wasn't something I just thought that was like the part where Christianity was warped by people who wanted to control others and ruin them. It's all about bliss and love and happiness and success and looking good. And, these guys over here telling you to mourn, they're trying to hold you down. That's religion, warping the words of Jesus to hold people back. That's what I really thought. How foolish of me to think that. But I did think that. So you want union with God. You want to come into perfect love. You want to set that example for family, right? You want to leave the world with less suffering than it had when you came. You want to take all the suffering that's been heaped upon you by others and transform it into God. You want to participate in the salvation of Christ, in the healing of souls. Then suffering is a part of that. And that means when you wake up in that space, it's not an inconvenience. And all things being equal, it's probably not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It could very well be a sign that you're doing something right. God has these two families of energies that God shines on people. This is the way I see it. I haven't really heard it spoken this way, but when I hear the way Christian mystics do speak of God's powers, it seems to me you can divide it up into two lights. Many rays, but two families. The light lights and the dark lights. And both of them can produce suffering in different ways. The light lights, like the bliss and the love and the joy. And if you have 3 or 4 days of that, you run out of chemicals in your brain, and you wake up. One day, you wake up, after a few days of a run of it maybe, you wake up pretty low. You wake up, just you've run out of chemicals, and there's disorder, and you feel dirty and clunky. And it's one of those days where you just can't quite do anything right. Everything goes wrong for you because you're off. So even the bright, loving, joy-filled lights can lead to purification on the other side of them. But the dark lights directly produce purification in the soul by actively bringing up those issues. And I was going to say forcing, but it's not a matter of being forced if you're on a path like this. Helping us to deal with the suffering that is in us so that we can turn to God for healing and so that we can have less suffering in us at the end of that day. And this is part of the path. And you know what? It's half the path. It's half. So anybody who wants to be happy all the time, there's no shot at all for union with God. No shot. You want to be in love all the time, you have no shot of enlightenment. That you have to do both. And we have to get it out of our heads that there is something wrong with us when we're in a place like that, where that kind of purification is happening and is necessary. And that has to be done with the reason, with the mind, because when the suffering comes up, it's real. So whatever you knew in that bright place, when you had all that faith, when the suffering arises, you fall into another state of mind and another state of being. You're really in it. And that's just going to look a little messy. If you've been on the path a long time, you've been through enough of those periods to know that it's leading to much greater healing. And you know that for a fact because it's happened to you so many times. But even then, it still just has to feel like it feels. It feels ugly, messy, clunky, dirty, disordered, sometimes hopeless. Sometimes the things that come up in us, there's just, just in my marriage, I'm just thinking of an example from my marriage. There was a time once in my marriage, a very bleak moment, a day. It was really a period of time, but it ended on this day when I decided that I knew in my bones that there was no way we would ever make it as a couple. And I knew that in my bones. I knew there was no way we could pull it off. And we had a number of problems. She had her problems, but I had mine. And our problems were they seemed incompatible. There just seemed to be no purchase. There seemed to be no place at which we could find any kind of stability. And, and I read about her attachment style and my attachment style. And they're like the worst for each other. They're the worst. They don't marry each other if you're like this. And, that's all in the past. That's a non-issue at this point. We're fine. We get happier every year. We have more love for each other every year, more peace, less disorder every year. But sometimes when you're in the midst of serious disorder, it looks and feels utterly hopeless to you, to us. But see, God isn't limited by all that stuff. God can take anything and heal it. So when you're in a state that's really low, it's going to feel low. It's going to feel disordered, depending on, how much disorder you have. on this, the lower end of the spectrum. I came from so much suffering. And I know people that came from a lot more suffering than me. And then I know people that have very little suffering in their life. They just didn't go through a lot. But nevertheless, everybody has to walk through some real periods where the Holy Spirit is showing them real darkness inside of them. You can't just decide to have a good day instead. You can't say, look, I'm going boating. We already had this planned. My friends have invited me, and I am not going to make time for this day. I'm going, and I'm going to be happy anyway. You can't be too busy for this. This path requires a lot of alone time. This path requires a lot of time set aside to be with God. And, I have a daughter, and a lot of people I know have families, and that's a little different. You have to show up for your kids. You have to show up for your duties. You have to show up for work. But it's a myth that you have to put all that away in order to show up for these things. There's a way to walk through suffering with a kind of dignity where you can still show up for another person in whatever way your role in life requires you to show up for another person. I went through the most night and darkness in my life in the first few years of my daughter being born. And when she was in front of my face, I gave her all of my loving attention. And then when she ran off down the hall, I went right back down into the suffering God was purifying in me. And when she came back around, I'd go back up into joy with her and love her and be with her. And then when she would leave, I would go back down into purification. This is not so hard to do if you're willing to do it. The thing that gets in the way most is our agendas. We think we don't have time. We think we don't want to. We think it means we're not spiritual if this stuff is coming up. The highest stages of Christian spirituality, we have 7 stages. So 7th stage is kind of enlightenment. There are degrees of it, but in the 7th stage, actual enlightenment happens. A permanent union with God that never leaves. A permanent surrender of the will to God forever that is never taken back. And you know what happens just before that? The deepest period of purification a soul goes through, ever on their journey. That's what happens right before enlightenment. So ever getting it in our heads that we shouldn't be in this place because we meditate, or we've been on the path a certain amount of time and so it shouldn't be happening. To get that in our heads is so wrong. And so we can't see suffering as a mistake. We can't see it as an inconvenience. Instead, we have to just make time for it and make space for it. And I'm going to do a bunch more segments soon on some other elements of the Christian path. This segment will go into the playlist that is Christian Essentials. Like, what is essential in order to get into union with God? What is essential to be a disciple of Christ? And it is absolutely essential that we make time for suffering and that we organize our lives in such a way that we have time for it. Being too busy all the time is a problem for a contemplative. There is nothing more important than our leisure time. There is nothing more important than our time that's not spent online and that's not spent in activity, but is spent just being with God. And a contemplative must create a lifestyle where there is space for that. Now, there's degrees of it. We know if you have 3 kids and a husband or a wife and a job, you're busier than a person that's single and alone. That's fine, no problem. But time must be made for this. Time must be made to feel these things, and time must be made to spend in God's presence with our disorder. And seeing it as a mistake is completely wrongheaded. Seeing it as proof that you're not spiritual or this stuff wouldn't be coming up is completely wrongheaded. Remember, at the sixth stage of the process towards enlightenment, that's when the darkest things arise. The root of the sin within the soul is uprooted, exposed to the light like a nerve ending, and it is felt profoundly, deeply. When you're almost enlightened, that happens. So how could anyone say they don't have time for it or they shouldn't be there? If we're being brought into perfect love, then there must be a lot of imperfections that need to be healed. If we're brought into perfect humility, there must be a lot of imperfections in pride that must be healed. If we're arriving at a place where we have died to ourselves, then there must be some time for death. Okay, I think that's enough on that topic. I want to add, though, as a piece to it. This is all linked up to deep meditation. And I don't know how I'm going to go about this on this channel. I want you to know that when I talk about this piece I'm going to say now, there is sometimes just a subtle frustration because there's no way to say it. You don't want to scare people, but you don't want them to not hear it. It's really tricky how to say this piece. But deep meditation is just, it must happen. We must learn to go deep in our meditation practice. And I want to just say that the best way to get there is to know you're not going deep. And I hope you don't have the kind of pride that just doesn't want to admit that because it's hurtful. You already decided you're deep. So now if someone says you're not deep, then you're offended. I hope you won't do that. I can for sure say easily that I'm not yet deep. I could say that. And I hope you can say it too. We must know we don't have it in order to get it. If we come at everything already full, already have it all, nothing, the glass is already full. Who can put water in it for you? Right? Who can do that? If you're already full, you know everything. You already know everything. You already have everything. So how can God give you more? The best way is to come with the glass empty. I don't know. I don't have everything. I don't know the way. You show me the way. So deep meditation is linked up to this suffering in a profound and important way. The level of depth you go to in meditation is the level of self you have forgotten for that moment. It's mini deaths. They're little mini deaths. It doesn't always feel like dying. What it feels like is going down. We say deep meditation, so that doesn't mean going up. So if you feel like you're going up in meditation, that's not deep. That's up. That's high. High has its place. But if you go high as it's possible to go, you will not automatically get deep. But if you go as deep as it's possible to go, you will automatically get the heights. So there's one direction is like the master direction. So when you're in your prayer life, you don't try to make this happen. Just hear it and make sure you're willing to do it. But don't try to make it happen. We want to let God be God. But at the same time, it feels like this. You begin your meditation time and you begin saying your sacred word over and over after you've prayed. There's a descending quality to deep meditation. You go lower and lower and lower. And at some point, you go low enough that you forget you're meditating. Or you forget where you are or who you are. You won't notice that. If you're that deep, you won't notice you're there. You only notice when you come back that you had gone somewhere so deep that you forgot you were even existing. But, and I know I'm not saying this right, I can tell, but it's something like that, where you really are getting down into a secret place like Jesus talks about. Alone. Where you don't have to take your mind off of grocery shopping because you forgot all about the existence of grocery shopping. You don't have to take your mind off your job because you have forgotten all about the existence of jobs. You don't have to take your mind off of a relationship you're in because you have forgotten all about the existence of relationships. You forget the world and you forget the self, and you go into a place where there's nothing and everything all at the same time. But you might not describe it like that. If you go there, don't hang on to those words, because you might not describe it like that when you're in there. You will lose time. If you go there and you're there for 20 minutes, it will feel like 2 minutes to you. You won't know. A lot of people will say, when they come out of a meditation session where I've been observing it, I'll say, well, you went pretty deep. What do you think? They say, I don't know if I went deep or not. I can't tell. I said, well, your breathing patterns really shifted to these deep breathing patterns that kind of show someone's gone quite deep. And they'll say, well, I don't know about that. Then I'll ask, how long do you think that was? And they'll say, well, 10 minutes. But the session was 50 minutes. So they went so deep, they missed time. That's deep. And another, don't hold me to all this, specifically. Don't think, I'm doing it wrong if it isn't like this. But also, if you've gone quite deep, you'll feel really heavy when you come out. When you stand up, you'll feel like you weigh twice as much as normal. Sometimes you might feel like you can hardly move your arms or legs at first. That's great. That means you're getting really into the deep, dense power of God. And there's a lot of healing that goes on there. The deeper you go into that, the more disorder you can notice in your soul. And that will arise to be healed. But also, the more willing you are to notice disorder, be honest about it and confront it directly, the deeper you'll go in meditation. Those two share a reciprocal relationship. If someone is fundamentally unwilling to see their disorder, they're going to have a very hard time going into deep meditation. Aside from special graces, there's always an exception to this. There could be an exceptional sincerity that the person has that kind of bypasses the naivety about them not wanting to look at their great disorder. And God will say, okay, for a while, I'll take you really deep anyway. But ultimately, both of these must be in place. We must be willing to suffer. We must be willing to see disorder again and again and again. We must not tire of it. We must not become disheartened by it. We have to make room for this part. And then our meditation, that's the barrier to deep meditation, our unwillingness to suffer. So that's the whole video. One little side note, I'll try to make everything available on this channel, eventually everything that I could tell you about it. But one person I know has a hard time going deep only because they're so attached to their family. So attached to their family that they can feel they're leaving their family behind as they go into this secret place. You can't take anyone with you. It's you and God down in there. And if you have attachments to the world or to people, right? Jesus said, if you love father and mother more than me, you're not worthy of the kingdom. Why? Because you got to go into these deep, secret places, profound places with God alone. No one can go with you. And if you don't walk alone, if you can't walk alone, if you always have to be with people, you can't go. If there's anything in the world that's just a must-have for you, no matter what, it'll keep you from going deep. So this is part of how it goes on the path. We notice this. We notice our attachments. We become willing to surrender them. I had to detach from my wife, but no one was asking me to leave my wife. I just had to quit clinging to her, right? My daughter, I love my daughter very much. More than anything in this world, that's for sure. But when I go into that secret place, I have to go alone. I can't take her with me. That's a place for me and God. That's a place before family, before fatherhood, before profession, before identity. What we were, what we are for real, the way God created us. We have to go spend time there. And we have to leave everything behind to do that. Okay, I hope this is helpful. If you have any comments or questions about this video, write them below and I'll do a whole nother section on that question. I really want to be helpful to everybody. So anything I can do, just write the question below, and if it's appropriate to answer that, if it's not too specific to an individual, if it's a principal question, I'll make a video on that question. And then if it isn't that, you could email me and ask a specific question or set up some kind of a phone call or something. Okay, thanks everybody. There's Venmo below and also PayPal if you want to become a supporter of this channel. I'd be very grateful for that. Please subscribe to the videos, to the channel, and like the videos. They'll help me reach more people. Okay, thank you very much.